The afternoon sun streamed through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors as travelers rushed to their destinations. Among them stood a distinguished-looking black man in his mid-40s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet success. His eyes were tired but alert as he made his way through the security checkpoint, the kind of exhaustion that comes after 3 days of giving presentations and sharing groundbreaking medical research with colleagues. The security line moved slowly, like it always does. He placed his expensive leather briefcase, a gift from his residence after a particularly challenging surgery, onto the conveyor belt. Next went his laptop, phone, and the suit jacket he'd worn nearly constantly during the conference. The TSA agent nodded at him with the mechanical politeness reserved for the thousands of faces they see each day. As he waited for his belongings to emerge from the other side of the scanner, he couldn't help but think about getting home to his family. His daughter had a piano recital that evening, and he promised to be there. The thought brought a small smile to his face, the first genuine one since he'd left the conference. The rhythmic hum of the security machines and the constant chatter of travelers filled the air. A child somewhere was crying about a misplaced stuffed animal. An elderly couple argued softly about their gate number. It was the normal chaos of airport life, until it wasn't. My laptop. Someone took my laptop. The shrill voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife. A woman in business attire, perhaps in her 30s, stood at the adjacent conveyor belt, her face flushed with panic and anger. I just saw someone pick up a laptop just like mine. Security personnel materialized almost instantly, their faces set in professional masks of concern. The woman's eyes darted around frantically before landing on him and his briefcase. Her expression shifted, and she pointed with absolute certainty. Him. I saw him pick up a laptop that looks exactly like mine. Time seemed to slow down. Other travelers stopped their hurried movements, turning to stare. The distinguished doctor felt his heart rate quicken, though his face remained carefully neutral. A skill learned through years of high-pressure surgeries. But this was different. This wasn't about steady hands and medical knowledge. This was about something far more personal, far more painful. The security officers approached him, their stance already suggesting guilt. One of them, a stocky man with a buzz cut, held up his hand in what was probably meant to be a calming gesture. "Sir, we need you to step aside for a moment." He could feel the weight of every stare, hear the whispers already starting. Some travelers quickly looked away when he glanced in their direction, while others watched the scene unfold with the kind of morbid curiosity reserved for car accidents and public arguments. Standing there, with his credentials in his pocket and years of respected medical service under his belt, he felt the familiar sting of prejudice wrapped in the guise of security concerns. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just hours ago, he'd been standing at a podium, teaching other doctors about the latest advances in neurosurgery. Now he was being viewed as a potential thief, all because of a confused passenger and the color of his skin. As the security officers began to close in around him, he took a deep breath, remembering his father's words from long ago. Sometimes, the best response to ignorance is excellence. With practiced calm, he prepared to address the situation, knowing that how he handled the next few moments would matter more than he could imagine. The security officers led him away from the main terminal, their footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The woman who made the accusation followed close behind, clutching her purse tightly as if protecting it from an imagined threat. Other travelers craned their necks to watch, some pulling out their phones, ready to record what they probably hoped would be another viral airport incident. "Right this way, sir," one of the officers said, gesturing toward a small room off the main corridor. His tone wasn't exactly rude, but it carried that edge of authority that suggested arguing would only make things worse. The doctor noticed how the officer's hand rested near his belt, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes about preconceptions and fear. Inside the room, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unflattering glow on the bare walls and simple metal table. A camera blinked silently in the corner. The doctor took the offered seat, placing his hands calmly on the table where they could be seen. Years of performing delicate surgeries had taught him the value of steady hands and a steady mind, even when everything inside you wants to scream at the injustice. Can you explain why you have a laptop matching the description of the one that's missing? The first officer asked, standing with his arms crossed. His colleague started typing on a computer in the corner, probably running some kind of background check. The doctor spoke clearly and professionally. I have my own laptop that I use for medical presentations. I just finished speaking at the National Neurosurgery Conference. I'm happy to show you the laptop, my credentials, and the conference materials. The woman who had accused him interrupted from where she stood near the door. That's exactly what my laptop looks like. It's the same brand, same color. Her voice carried a tremor of both anger and uncertainty now, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. The second officer looked up from his computer. Sir, we'll need to search your briefcase and verify your story. The way he said, verify your story, made it clear they weren't inclined to believe him just yet. As they began searching through his belongings, the doctor maintained his composure, though his thoughts drifted to his daughter's piano recital. Each minute here was another minute he might be late. He promised her he wouldn't miss it, just like he'd promised never to miss another important moment after spending so many years focused on his medical career. The woman paced near the doorway, describing her laptop in detail, a common model used by thousands of business travelers every day. The doctor noticed her voice wavering slightly as she watched the officers carefully remove his conference presentations, medical journals, and finally his laptop from his briefcase. Ma'am, could you please come verify if this is your laptop? One officer held up the doctor's computer. The woman stepped forward eagerly, then stopped. Her face fell as she looked more closely at it. I'm not sure, she said, her confidence beginning to crack. Mine had a small scratch near the corner and a sticker from my company. The doctor quietly pulled out his phone and pulled up photos from his presentation earlier that day. Images clearly showing him using this same laptop while speaking to a room full of medical professionals. He didn't say anything yet, just waited as the woman's certainty continued to crumble. One of the officers was now reading through his credentials more carefully, his eyes widening slightly as he realized exactly who they had pulled into questioning. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, the air heavy with the weight of what was becoming increasingly clear. They had jumped to conclusions based on nothing more than prejudice and panic. The tension was suddenly broken by a burst of radio static. Security team, we've had a report of a laptop found at Checkpoint C. Owner claims they left it behind after their screening. The woman's face drained of color as the realization hit her. She had been so quick to accuse, so certain in her assumption, and now the truth was unraveling in front of everyone in that small, uncomfortable room. The small security room felt even more cramped as the officers shifted uncomfortably in their positions. The senior officer cleared his throat, looking down at the doctor's credentials again. His eyes kept moving between the professional photo ID and a distinguished man sitting calmly before him. The contrast between their initial treatment and the reality of who they were questioning was becoming painfully clear. So, you're saying you were the keynote speaker at the medical conference? The younger officer asked, his tone noticeably softer now. The doctor nodded, pulling out a conference program from his briefcase. On the cover was a photo of him performing a complex brain surgery, his steady hands working with a precision that had saved countless lives. Yes, I was discussing new techniques in pediatric neurosurgery, he explained, his voice carrying the same patience he used when teaching new residents. We've developed a method that reduces recovery time for children by almost 40%. He didn't add that he pioneered this technique, or that he'd spent the last 5 years perfecting it. His work spoke for itself. The woman who had accused him was now pressed against the far wall, her face a mix of embarrassment and shame. Her earlier certainty had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. She opened her mouth to speak several times, but no words came out. "Could you walk us through your schedule today?" the senior officer asked, though it was clear this was now more formality than interrogation. The doctor could have shown frustration, could have let his anger at the situation show, but instead, he remained professional. "I gave the closing speech at 11 a.m., he said, pulling up his presentation schedule on his phone. "After that, I had a brief meeting with some colleagues about implementing these techniques at their hospitals. My flight was at 3 p.m. because—" He paused for a moment, allowing a small smile to cross his face. "My daughter has her first piano recital tonight. She's playing Beethoven." The simple mention of his daughter's recital seemed to hit everyone in the room hard. It was a stark reminder that they weren't dealing with a stereotype or a suspicion. They were dealing with a father trying to get home to his child's special moment. The radio crackled again, this time with more details about the found laptop. Owner confirmed at Checkpoint C business traveler left it after going through screening. Matter resolved. The silence that followed was deafening. The woman's laptop had been at another checkpoint all along, exactly where she had left it in her rush to catch her flight. All of this, the accusation, the questioning, the implicit bias, had been for nothing. The senior officer was about to speak, presumably to offer an apology, when another voice came over the radio, this one urgent and sharp. "Medical emergency on incoming Flight 2374. Passengers showing signs of severe neurological distress. Any medical personnel in the terminal, please respond." The doctor was already standing, his professional instincts kicking in. "Where's the incoming flight?" he asked, all thoughts of the previous situation forgotten. The officers looked at him in surprise, but the senior one quickly grabbed his radio. "We have a neurosurgeon here," he said into the radio, a hint of awe in his voice. "Top of his field. Where do you need him?" The same people who had questioned his character moments ago were now looking at him with a mixture of respect and amazement. The woman who had accused him had tears in her eyes, the full weight of her mistake hitting her as she watched him prepare to potentially save someone's life. As they rushed out of the security room, the doctor's mind was already shifting into emergency mode, mentally reviewing possible scenarios and treatments. This was who he was, not a suspect, not a stereotype, but a healer. And right now, someone needed his help. The airport terminal transformed into a blur of motion as the doctor rushed alongside security personnel towards Gate B7. The same people who had stared at him with suspicion earlier now pressed themselves against walls and shop entrances, making way for what was clearly an emergency response team. The woman who had accused him followed at a distance, unable to tear herself away from the unfolding drama. "Flight 2374 is landing now," someone called out over the radio. "Patient is a middle-aged man, found unresponsive by flight attendants about 20 minutes before landing. Severe headache reported earlier during flight." The doctor's mind raced through possibilities as they ran. A severe headache, followed by unconsciousness, could mean an aneurysm. And in his experience, time was precious in these situations. Every second could mean the difference between life and death. "Do we have a medical kit at the gate?" he called out to one of the airport staff running alongside him. His voice carried the authority of someone used to running emergency rooms and leading surgical teams. "Yes, sir. And paramedics are 3 minutes out," the staff member responded, slightly out of breath from trying to keep up with the doctor's pace. They reached the gate just as the plane was pulling up to the jet bridge. The doctor could see flight attendants through the plane's windows, hovering over what must be the patient's seat. His hands, the same hands that had been placed flat on a security table just minutes ago, now moved swiftly through the emergency medical kit that a gate agent handed him. "I need space cleared in the jet bridge," he commanded, and security quickly began moving people back. "And get me the brightest lights you have." His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried an urgency that made everyone snap to attention. The plane door opened, and the scene inside was exactly what he'd feared. A man lay slumped in his seat, his face ashen, while his terrified wife clutched his hand. The flight attendants had done their best, keeping his airway clear and monitoring his breathing, but they looked relieved to see a medical professional. "Sir, I'm a neurosurgeon," the doctor said to the unconscious man's wife as he quickly moved to examine the patient. "Can you tell me exactly when his headache started?" The wife, fighting back tears, explained how her husband had complained of the worst headache of his life about 2 hours into the flight. "He said it felt like something exploded in his head," she whispered. The doctor's fingers moved expertly, checking vital signs and pupil responses. The right pupil was blown, a telling sign. His expression remained calm, but his actions took on even greater urgency. "We need to move him very carefully," he instructed the arriving paramedics. "I suspect a ruptured aneurysm. We'll need immediate transfer to the nearest hospital with a neuro unit." As they carefully moved the patient, the doctor noticed the growing crowd at the gate. Among them stood the security officers and the woman who had accused him, all watching with a mixture of awe and shame as he worked to save a life. The same hands they had assumed might be those of a thief were now potentially the only thing standing between this man and death. The paramedics worked seamlessly with the doctor, responding to his quick, clear instructions. His presence seemed to calm everyone: the patient's wife, the flight attendants, even the other passengers who had been frightened by the emergency. "BP is dropping," one paramedic called out. "Start him on IV fluids," the doctor responded without hesitation. "We need to keep his blood pressure steady, but not too high. And get me a direct line to the hospital's neurology department. I'll need their operating room ready the moment we arrive." As they prepared to move the patient, the doctor caught a glimpse of the time on the gate's display. His daughter's recital would start in less than 2 hours. But right now, another family needed him more. Sometimes, he knew, being a doctor meant making hard choices. He pulled out his phone, prepared to make a call he didn't want to make, but first, he had a life to save. The airport's medical response room had become a hub of intense activity. The doctor worked with practiced efficiency, his earlier ordeal in the security room feeling like a distant memory. The patient's wife sat nearby, her hands clasped in prayer as she watched the medical team work. "His blood pressure is stabilizing," a paramedic announced, checking the monitors. The doctor nodded but didn't take his eyes off his patient. Years of experience had taught him that in cases like this, every detail mattered. He noticed slight twitching in the patient's right hand, another concerning sign. Just then, the airport's chief of security burst through the door. He was a tall man with graying hair, slightly out of breath as if he'd run there. "Doctor," he said, his voice carrying a mix of respect and urgency, "I just learned who you are. You're not just any neurosurgeon. You're the head of neurosurgery at Central State Hospital." The doctor barely looked up from his patient. "That's correct," he said simply, adjusting the IV drip. "But right now, I'm just a doctor trying to save this man's life. Could you please contact Central State? Tell him to prepare OR1. I'll need my team ready when we arrive." The security chief's face reddened slightly. "Of course, doctor. And about what happened earlier?" He glanced at the woman who had accused the doctor. She was still there, standing quietly in the corner, watching everything unfold with tears in her eyes. "Later," the doctor said firmly, his attention still focused on his patient. "Right now, this man needs all of our attention." His dedication was clear. This wasn't about proving himself or making others feel guilty. This was about saving a life. The patient's wife looked up at the mention of the hospital. "Central State. That's the best neurosurgery department in the state," she said, hope creeping into her voice for the first time. "Are you really the head surgeon there?" The doctor gave her a gentle smile as he checked her husband's pupils again. "Yes, I am. And I promise you, your husband is going to get the best care possible." He didn't mention that he pioneered several of the techniques he might need to use, or that doctors came from around the world to learn from him. The paramedics were already preparing for transport. The doctor had called ahead to his surgical team, and they were assembling even now. The efficiency of the response was impressive, a stark contrast to the chaos of the security incident earlier. The woman who had made the accusation stepped forward hesitantly. "Doctor, she began, her voice shaking. He held up a hand, not unkindly. "We all have lessons to learn in life," he said quietly. "Right now, let's focus on making sure this man gets to surgery." His words were gentle but firm, showing a grace that made her tears flow even harder. The airport chief of security was already on his phone, arranging for a police escort to the hospital. "We'll get you there in record time, doctor," he assured him. The same authority that had been used against the doctor earlier was now being used to help him save a life. As they prepared to move the patient, the doctor quickly checked his phone. His daughter's recital would start in just over an hour. He knew he wouldn't make it. Brain surgery wasn't something you could rush. With a heavy heart, he sent a quick message to his wife. "Emergency brain surgery. Patient needs me. Tell our little girl I'm so sorry, and I'll make it up to her. Show her the video of Daddy's surgery on the news tonight. Love you both." As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. He saw not the man who had been suspected of theft, but the surgeon he always been. Someone dedicated to saving lives, regardless of the circumstances. The patient was being moved onto a stretcher now, and the doctor knew that the real challenge was just beginning. The next few hours would determine not just one man's fate, but perhaps how everyone in that airport would think about their own prejudices in the future. The emergency vehicle's sirens cut through the afternoon traffic as they sped towards Central State Hospital. Inside the ambulance, the doctor remained focused on his patient, whose condition was growing more critical by the minute. The man's blood pressure was rising dangerously, a sign that the pressure in his brain was increasing. "Stay with me," the doctor muttered, more to himself than the unconscious patient. His hands moved swiftly, adjusting medication doses and checking vital signs. The paramedic beside him watched in amazement as he handled multiple tasks with the calm precision of someone who had done this countless times before. The patient's wife had insisted on riding in the ambulance too. She sat quietly in the corner, clutching her husband's wallet and phone. "We were just coming back from our son's graduation," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sirens. "He was so proud. He gave a speech at the ceremony." The doctor glanced at her, his eyes kind despite the intensity of the situation. "Tell me more about your family," he said, even as his hands continued their careful work. He knew from experience that keeping family members talking helped calm them during crisis situations. As she spoke about her son's achievements and her husband's dedication as a father, the doctor noticed the patient's right hand twitch again. Not good. They needed to move faster. "How much longer?" he called to the driver. 3 minutes, doctor. Police escort is clearing the way." The doctor nodded, then spoke into his phone, which was on speaker mode connected to his surgical team. "Prep the patient for immediate surgery. I want everything ready the moment we arrive. Time is brain." Through the ambulance's back window, he could see several cars following them. The airport security chief's vehicle, and behind that, a car with the woman who had accused him, her face still streaked with tears. They had all insisted on coming, perhaps driven by a mix of concern and conscience. The hospital came into view, its familiar outline bringing a sense of purpose to the doctor. This was his domain, where his skills and knowledge mattered more than his appearance or others' prejudices. His surgical team was already waiting at the emergency entrance, their faces showing relief at seeing their chief surgeon. As they rushed through the corridors, the doctor quickly briefed his team. Suspected ruptured aneurysm. Patient lost consciousness during flight. Deteriorating neurological signs. We'll need to work fast. His team moved like a well-oiled machine, each person knowing their role perfectly. The woman from the airport and the security chief watched from behind the waiting room glass as the doctor and his team prepared for surgery. They could see him speaking softly to the patient's wife. his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder before he turned to head into the operating room. Just before entering, he paused and looked back at the group from the airport. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying years of wisdom, "life gives us unexpected chances to learn from our mistakes and to see people for who they really are." Then he turned and walked through the doors, his surgical cap hiding the same head that had been viewed with suspicion just hours ago. Inside the operating room, the familiar sounds of medical equipment and the steady beep of monitors filled the air. The doctor took his position at the head of the operating table, his shoulders straight, his focus absolute. A nurse helped him with his surgical gown and gloves. "Scalpel," he said calmly, and the long procedure began. As he made the first precise incision, he couldn't help but think about how different this moment was from his experience at the airport. Here, in this room, his hands weren't suspected of wrongdoing. They were trusted to perform miracles. Looking around at his team, seeing the respect and trust in their eyes, he felt a profound sense of purpose. This was why he had chosen this path, why he had persevered through years of training and countless challenges. In this moment, nothing mattered except saving this patient's life. Not the color of his skin, not the prejudices he'd faced, just his ability to heal. Hours ticked by in the operating room as the doctor worked with intense concentration. Sweat beaded on his forehead under the surgical lights, but his hands remained perfectly steady. The surgery was complex, the kind that left no room for error. Every movement had to be precise, every decision immediate and correct. "Suction here, please," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the delicate brain tissue exposed before him. The aneurysm was worse than they'd initially thought, a ticking time bomb that could have erupted completely at any moment. In a way, the patient had been fortunate it happened near someone who could help. Outside in the waiting room, an unusual group had gathered. The patient's wife sat surrounded by strangers who had become part of this unexpected drama. The airport security officers, the woman who had made the accusation, and even a few of the flight attendants who had stayed well past their shift to learn the patient's fate. "He's the best there is," one of the nurses assured them during a brief update. "If anyone can help your husband, it's him." The wife nodded tearfully, while the woman from the airport wiped fresh tears from her eyes, the weight of her earlier accusations feeling heavier with each passing minute. Back in the operating room, the doctor was reaching the most critical part of the procedure. The microsurgery required him to work between blood vessels thinner than a strand of hair. Through the microscope, he could see the damaged vessel that had nearly cost this man his life. "BP's rising," called out the anesthesiologist. "I see it," the doctor responded calmly. Just a few more moments. His focus was absolute, his movements careful but sure. This was the moment where experience meant everything. Knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly where to place the tiny clip that would prevent further bleeding. Time seemed to stand still in the operating room as he worked. His team watched in silence, knowing they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just surgery, this was artistry, the kind of skill that only came from years of dedication and thousands of hours of practice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he stepped back slightly. "Clip is secure," he announced. "Let's check for any other bleeding." His team let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The next 40 minutes were spent carefully closing, every layer given the same attention to detail as the critical repair had been. The doctor knew that recovery would be long, but he also knew that without this surgery, there would have been no recovery at all. As he began to close the final layer, he thought about how this day had unfolded. Just hours ago, he had been treated like a criminal, judged before anyone knew who he was or what he was capable of. Now he had quite literally held someone's life in those same suspected hands. "BP stabilizing," the anesthesiologist reported. "Stats looking good." The doctor nodded, a small smile hidden behind his surgical mask. This was why he had pushed through every barrier, every prejudice, every obstacle in his path to become a surgeon. Moments like these made it all worthwhile. As he placed the final suture, he remembered his daughter's recital. He had missed it, but he knew that someday she would understand why. Today's events would become a story he would tell her. A story about perseverance, about judgment, and about the power of rising above it all to do what you were meant to do. Surgery complete, he announced quietly. Excellent work, everyone. His team broke into soft applause, not just for the successful surgery, but for everything this moment represented. They had watched their chief surgeon transform a day of prejudice into one of healing, turning what could have been a story of bias into one of redemption. As he stepped away from the operating table, a nurse touched his arm gently. "Doctor, there are a lot of people waiting to hear from you out there." He nodded, removing his surgical mask. It was time to give the patient's wife the good news, and perhaps help heal more than just physical wounds on this remarkable day. The doctor walked into the waiting room, still wearing his surgical scrubs, his surgical cap in his hands. The moment he appeared, everyone stood up. The patient's wife, the airport security team, the woman who had accused him, and the flight attendants. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Walking directly to the patient's wife, he gave her a warm smile. "Your husband made it through the surgery successfully," he said gently. "The aneurysm is repaired, and while recovery will take time, I expect him to make a full recovery." The wife burst into tears of relief, her hands clasped over her mouth. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching out to grasp his hand. The same hand that others had viewed with suspicion just hours before. "Thank you for saving him." The airport security chief stepped forward, his face showing a mix of admiration and shame. "Doctor, I don't even know where to begin," he started, his voice heavy with emotion. "What happened at the airport today? The way we treated you." The doctor raised his hand, not in dismissal, but in understanding. "Today has been a learning experience for all of us," he said, his voice tired but kind. "What matters is that we grow from it." The woman who had accused him of theft could no longer contain herself. She stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I jumped to conclusions. I let my prejudices. I never even considered." She couldn't finish her sentences through her tears. The doctor looked at her thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "in surgery, we have a saying. Look twice, cut once. It means we should always be absolutely sure before we take action. Perhaps that's a principle we could all apply to our daily lives." One of the flight attendants spoke up. "We watched you work during the emergency on the plane. The way you took charge, how calm you stayed. It was amazing." The doctor smiled slightly. "In my profession, we don't have the luxury of letting other people's assumptions affect our work. Lives depend on our focus and skill." He paused, looking at each person in the room. "But I would be lying if I said it doesn't hurt when people judge me based on my appearance rather than my abilities." The security chief cleared his throat. "We're implementing new training protocols at the airport," he announced. "And sir, if you're willing, we'd like your input on them. Your experience, well, it could help prevent this from happening to someone else." The woman who had made the accusation wiped her eyes. "I'll never forget this day," she said softly. "How quickly I jumped to accuse you, and then watching you save that man's life. I'm going to share this story with everyone I know." The doctor looked at his watch. It was well past midnight now. His daughter's recital had long since ended. As if reading his mind, the patient's wife asked, "Didn't you mention something about your daughter's piano recital?" He nodded. "Yes, she was playing Beethoven tonight. Her first solo performance." "And you missed it to save my husband," she said, fresh tears in her eyes. "It's what any doctor would do," he replied simply. "Tomorrow, I'll explain to her that sometimes we have to make hard choices to help others. It's a lesson I learned from my own father, and one I hope she'll understand." The security chief stepped forward again. "Doctor, your daughter, Would she be willing to do another performance? We could arrange something at the airport. Make it special. It's the least we could do. The doctor was about to respond when a nurse rushed in. Doctor, your patient is waking up. He's asking for his wife. As the wife hurried to follow the nurse, she turned back to the doctor. You're not just a great surgeon, she said. You're a great teacher, too. You've taught us all something today about dignity, excellence, and forgiveness. The doctor watched her go, feeling the weight of the day's events. Sometimes, he thought, the most important healing happens not in the operating room, but in the hearts and minds of people who learn to see past their prejudices. 1 week later, the airport's main terminal looked very different from the day of the incident. A beautiful grand piano had been placed near the center, surrounded by flowers and a small crowd of people. The doctor's daughter, wearing a pretty blue dress, sat at the piano, her feet barely touching the pedals. The patient, now recovering well, sat in a wheelchair in the front row, his wife beside him. He still had bandages on his head, but his eyes were bright and alert. Behind them sat airport staff, security personnel, and many travelers who had stopped to watch the unusual scene unfold. The woman who had made the accusation was there too, but now she was helping to organize the event, handing out programs that told the story of what had happened that day. We want everyone to learn from this, she had said while planning the concert. How a moment of prejudice turned into a miracle of healing. The airport's chief of security stepped up to a microphone. A week ago, something happened in this terminal that changed many lives, he began. We witnessed how quickly we can judge others without knowing their story, but we also saw how grace and excellence can teach us to be better. The doctor sat next to his daughter at the piano, looking much more relaxed than he had during the emergency surgery. He wore a simple suit instead of surgical scrubs, and his smile was warm as he looked at his little girl. Today, the security chief continued, we're not just here for a piano recital. We're here to celebrate second chances. The second chance at life that our recovering patient received, thanks to the skill of this remarkable doctor. And the second chance we all got to learn about looking beyond our assumptions. The doctor's daughter looked up at her father, who nodded encouragingly. Her small fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of Beethoven's For Elise filled the terminal. Travelers stopped with their luggage, airport staff paused in their duties, all listening to the sweet music that seemed to wash away the memory of that tense day. As his daughter played, the doctor thought about how this moment had come to be. The security team had not only arranged the recital, but had also implemented new training programs. The woman who had accused him was now volunteering to share her story at diversity awareness sessions. Even the airlines had reached out, wanting to learn from the experience. The patient's wife held her husband's hand as they listened to the music. Just days ago, she had been terrified of losing him. Now, thanks to the doctor they had initially judged so wrongly, they were planning their son's wedding together. When the final notes faded away, the applause was thunderous. The doctor's daughter beamed with pride, but her biggest smile was for her father. She had understood why he missed her first recital. You were being a hero, Daddy, she had said when he explained it to her. The patient slowly stood from his wheelchair, supported by his wife, and made his way to the piano. Doctor, he said, his voice still a bit weak but full of emotion, I don't just owe you my life. Your story, what happened that day, it's changing how people think. My own grandchildren will grow up in a world that's a little better because of what happened here. The woman who had made the accusation approached with a plaque to be hung in the terminal. On it was a simple message. Look twice before judging once. A reminder that excellence knows no color, and healing comes in many forms. As photos were taken and hands were shaken, the doctor noticed something remarkable. The same terminal where he had once been viewed with suspicion was now filled with people seeing him for who he really was, not just a skilled surgeon, but a teacher, a father, and a reminder that sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our greatest moments of growth. His daughter tugged at his sleeve. Can we play the duet now, Daddy? She asked. He sat down beside her at the piano, and together, their fingers danced across the keys, creating something beautiful. In that moment, surrounded by the harmony of music and newfound understanding, the airport terminal had become more than just a place of travel. It had become a place of transformation.